you'll hear a version of the question. Okay? So the first one is, what tools do you suggest for a child who does not want to take medication any longer to help with focus and motivation?
My first thing would be to ask them why. Because sometimes the reason that somebody doesn't want to take medication is that it's making a lot of trouble for them. A typical thing that you hear often is that there's some people with ADHD who take medication and will say, it helps me focus, but I get too serious on it, and my friends tell me that I'm not fun anymore. Usually when that's the case, the dose is too high or it's not the right medication for that person, but that needs to be adjusted. Or usually, often when people start taking stimulant medications, they find that they're not able to, they don't feel very hungry for lunch. Usually they can eat breakfast and then they can also eat dinner, but lunch not so much. But you get some people, that usually goes away within a matter of at the least a month or two at the most. But there's some people where it persists. So there are some good reasons why some people will say, look, I don't want to take this medicine. And maybe it's a matter of adjusting the dose. Maybe it's a matter of trying a different medicine or changing the timing of the dosing. So that fine-tuning is critical. Some people don't want to take the medicine because they feel like it's a sign that they're defective. And that if I'm taking it, it says there's something really wrong with me. And that's the time I'm likely to ask, okay, well, are there other people who've been telling you that? Or, where do you get the idea of it? And then I'll often use the example, for example, of the eyeglasses and the difficulty that people have seeing without them, and it might be worthwhile considering that. But I don't believe in forcing people to take medication because it doesn't work. This is not available in suppository form. So it makes sense only if you can get, because kids, if they don't want to take the medicine, they can just stick it in the side of the mouth and then wait until they go outside. I had one mother who discovered that they had a large plant in a vase outside the door, and one day she happened to pulling some dead leaves out of it and saw that there was a massive collection of the medication that accumulated in the vase. The kid would take it and then walk out the door, toss it on the way out, and that was that. But what you can do is to say, look, you don't have to take the medicine, but you have to get your work done. Your job is to be a student, and if you're not going to be a decent student, don't expect you're going to get all the goodies from us that you otherwise would like. Life has some consequences. And we are willing to offer you medication. We're willing to offer you some help with people who can help you sort this thing out. But if you are not going to do your work with or without medicine, then you're going to pay. And you have to figure out the individual, how old is the kid and what's going to work with them. And you can also use, you usually catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And so if you can offer some kind of reward that's actually going to be there, because many parents will say, why would I reinforce my kid and pay my kid for doing his job? To which my answer is often, would you go to work every day if you didn't get a paycheck? Being a student is not an easy job. And so sometimes, many kids don't need that, but some do. So I wouldn't punish for not taking medicine, but I certainly would for somebody who refuses to do his or her work.
Okay, here's a related question. What do you suggest if your child refuses assistance, such as an academic coach or a tutor?
I would repeat the same thing I just said, and that is, bottom line is, how are you doing at your job? Your job is to be a student. Now, and keep in mind, though, that not every assistance that we offer is any good. There are some coaches who are characterized by much enthusiasm and not much skill. They're just working on getting credentialing for coaches these days. And you've got some who are very militaristic, Metternickian characters who are just, by God, you must do this and must do that. And there are others who are wonderful at being able to meet the student where he or she is and be able to help them go on from there. So when a kid is refusing to use resources, the first thing is to take them seriously and see if there might be some real reasons why it's not such a good idea, and see if they've got any better ideas. But it's often necessary to remind children that the grown-ups are running the world and not the children. And if you want some of what I have to give you, there are going to be some conditions that you need to meet in order to get in order to get me to give them to you. That's the way the world is.
Okay. How can people with ADHD learn to better read social cues and then therefore navigate social situations?
That's an important question. For years, there was a rule in the diagnostic manual saying that if somebody had a pervasive, developmental disorder, like anything which now would be considered on the autistic spectrum, where they're sort of out of it socially, they have a difficulty reading others' emotions, they tend to focus only on a few narrow things, that's all they'll talk about or do with people. I'm not talking about the severe autism now, I'm talking about the high functioning end. That you weren't supposed to make a diagnosis of ADHD because that was subsumed underneath the pervasive developmental disorders. Well, guess what? There were a lot of studies which said, folks, you got that wrong. There are many people on the autistic spectrum who have ADHD problems, and they actually often do better if you treat the ADHD symptoms. But the other thing they found was, another surprise, guess what? A lot of people with ADHD have some autistic characteristics where they're not very skilled in dealing with other people and need some help in doing that. And sometimes the medication is helpful for that. Typically, somebody on the autistic spectrum, you've got to watch the dosing because their body chemistry is sometimes quite sensitive to it. And that what would normally be a good-sized dose for an average person might be way too much for them. But I think the main thing is to put it on the table and say, look, for example, I had a brilliant student in my office the other day, and I had to say to him, hey, look, it's happening again. And he said, what? And I said, you're staring at the rug, and you have been in here for about 10 minutes, and you haven't looked at me once. I am not beautiful, but I would like to have some eye contact. And he said, well, people say that to me sometimes. And so I've got a guy who is one of the most brilliant kids in the computer science department, and his ability to do that coding, and he has a mind that works beautifully for that. And he actually was accepted to MIT, but chose not to go there because he wanted to be more well-rounded and take a liberal arts curriculum. And yet for him, functioning in that sort of situation was going to be more difficult. And so that becomes a focus of treatment. That if a person has difficulty with social interaction, then that's one of the things that you focus on. And sometimes the medication can help that, sometimes it doesn't. But it's one of many things that needs some talk. But the main thing is to render it discussable and say that, look, that if the person doesn't recognize it, if it's obvious when you're talking with them, tell them.
Next one, what does research suggest about the relationship between ADHD and giftedness?
Nothing. You get these articles that say people who have ADHD are all gifted. Not true. And you get some articles saying people with ADHD are not smart. Not true. ADHD is something you find at every point along the spectrum of intelligence, and it's quite independent of it, so long as you're looking at the breakout of the IQ scores and not lumping together working memory and processing speed in with the scores that you have. You've got to break it out and see that on the Wechsler IQ tests, there are 4 index scores now. They used to have one for verbal and the other performance. They were lumping together a bunch of stuff that didn't belong together. And so now we've got 4 index scores on it, one for verbal comprehension, another for perceptual reasoning. Those are not particularly affected by ADHD. And then you've got working memory and processing speed. Those are. And so if you throw all that stuff together, then you get some lower IQ scores, but the samples have been pretty biased. But the fact is, you can be any place. It doesn't mean that you've got a free pass and be considered a genius. It does not mean that you're stupid. It means that you could be any place on that range. But the other thing that I think is also really important is with those kids who are, young people who are quite smart, it's also important to not make the issue how smart they are. It's fine to talk with them about that sometimes, but there's good research. Carol Dweck has done some really interesting research, which says that if you have a kid whom you bring up on the idea of you are brilliant, this is very helpful to you, they tend to crash and burn much more easily because their self-esteem is so fragile. Because they're operating with the assumption that their intelligence is a fixed entity, and they now have just, they get into college or they get into these advanced courses and they just can't do it, so I guess I'm really stupid even though people told me that I was all right. So I'm brilliant up through 8th grade, and after that I'm a loser. That makes no sense. What you want to do is to make clear, I have many people who will say, well, I have an IQ of 125. And I said, yes, but you're failing 3 subjects. Why? The reality is nobody is going to care about how smart you are if you cannot deliver the goods. Let's talk about what's getting in the way of your being able to do your work. So the issue of intelligence, I think it's a problem. If people who are very bright and they're not troublemakers who have ADHD, they often will not be recognized until much later in their career than other people will. And I think that's a population I'm really concerned about. But I also recognize that their salvation does not lie in their IQ test scores. Their salvation is in terms of what they're going to be able to do in terms of getting along with other people and what they're going to be able to do about being able to work productively. And that's the kind of thing that hopefully therapists and counselors available can help them with.
Thank you. We had a lot of questions about anxiety and depression and its relationship to ADHD, so here's one that captures a lot of it. Do people, especially adults, often get diagnosed with anxiety or depression when it's really ADHD?
Yes. And there's a very simple reason for it, because often that's the thing which is most obvious to the clinicians. But there's another reason for that, and that is that clinicians mostly have not got any training in recognizing ADHD in adolescents and adults. I teach in a medical school, and I can tell you that even in our medical school, when they graduate after 3 years, they have typically had not more than 20 minutes of education about ADHD. And most of that was about little kids in pediatrics unit. And so when you're dealing with a psychologist or psychiatrist or other mental health worker, APRN or whatever, you can't assume that they know what ADHD looks like or how to treat it. Some of us are working hard to try and get the message out, but the fact is there are many people who simply do not have that training. They may know an awful lot about a lot of other things. And so what do most of us do most of the time if we've got a situation we can't understand? We fit it to one of the pigeonholes we've got in our system. And so very often, the person with ADHD is going to be anxious. Of course, you worry about falling on your face in a situation or embarrassing yourself. Or many of the people I see who come in with ADHD are very discouraged with the way things are going. I had this one student who taught me a long time ago. He said, I've got there are 2 types of depression. There's the heavy-duty stuff where you wonder if you'd be better off dead. And then there's the one where just everything is discouraging. And this one kid said, I just walk around all the time feeling everything sucks, everything has always sucked, everything always will suck, and that's just the way it is. I can get out of it when something interesting is going on, but as soon as the interesting part is over, I go right back to feeling like everything sucks, what's the use, why bother? And he was able to do most of the stuff he needed to do, but the motivation was not very there. In that situation, he was somewhat depressed, but his eating and sleeping were not in bad shape. And he wasn't suffering from suicidal thoughts or behaviors or putting himself at risk. And so in that case, my first intervention was to deal with the ADHD, which was quite obvious. And in that situation, it cleared up the depression, because the depression was essentially demoralization because of the fact that he was in this situation where he just wasn't able to see his way out of it. I compare trying to go to school with an ADHD which is not adequately treated is sort of like trying to run the Boston Marathon with a knapsack of bricks on your back. You can do it, but you've got to work a lot harder than everybody else. And the results you get for your efforts aren't anywhere near what they would be for anybody else with the same amount of ability and the same amount of effort who just didn't have to carry the bricks. And in my mind, what we're trying to do when we're working with students who have ADHD is helping them get some of the bricks out of their backpack so they've got a fair chance to run the race. That doesn't mean they're going to be jet propelled to the front of the line, But it does mean that they'll have a more fair chance of being able to do it.
Thank you. How do you effectively ease the removal of scaffolding provided by parents and teachers and coaches to ultimately increase self-sufficiency?
By taking away some scaffolding and adding some more for other things. The development for most of us is, you gradually learn how to do the easier things, and then, the people were doing for you, and then hopefully, that comes away, and then you try more and more difficult things. And that's the way we help, kids to learn how to get themselves dressed, how to brush their teeth, how to cross the street, how to ride a bike, eventually how to drive a car, perhaps. And but the thing is that the point at which you pull it back is not always the same for everybody. The range of normal is wide. And there are some people who are very early to achieve some of these milestones, just like there's some kids who start talking early, and the parents who have been long waiting for them to begin to talk find themselves, be careful what you wish for, because they won't shut up. And then there are other kids where you wait a long time before you hear the first sentence. So there needs to be some real flexibility in that, and trying to target it in terms of the specific person that you're dealing with.
Thank you. How does parenting style affect the foundation and development of executive functioning skills?
I don't think there's any one style of parenting that we can say that's the best way to do it. Parents are people. And there's a lot of variety in styles, and sometimes it's quite amazing how one thing that wouldn't work with this kid will work very well with another kid, even within your own family. However, the thing is that the two things that I think are more problematic are if you don't do enough to help support the things that you want to see grow, they don't grow. If you don't fertilize it, it doesn't grow. And by fertilizing, in this case, I mean things like showing interest in the thing that the kid is working on and studying, and that goes for everything. Most parents are really pretty good at it with preschool. Oh, that's the greatest drawing. You can't. What the hell is it? But the fact is, you learn to ask. Well, tell me about it. But the fact is that it's this kid's effort, and you want to encourage that and support that, and sometimes they amaze you with what they can actually do. And to show interest, if the kid is saying, okay, I'm doing a project, I remember my son, he had a project to do on the Vietnam War. And having lived through that period, I was really interested in it. And we went to the library and got a bunch of books, and we were sitting down on the floor looking at the books, and we were talking about the Vietnam War, and he was asking me questions about what I remembered about what it was like during that period and so forth. And, he later talked about how much I had done to help him develop his interest in learning, when all I was doing was sharing my interest in the same thing he was learning about and wishing that I could still go back and study that kind of stuff. But there's another risk. I consult at an independent day school with pre-K through 12, and every year they ask me to talk with the parents about the new kids who are coming in, about what their experience is likely to be. And one of the things that I often have to speak to them about is I say, look, you folks are all quite accomplished people. You've done pretty well for yourselves. For one thing, that you can afford to send your kids to this expensive school. But let me tell you, it's very difficult to be the son or daughter of a very successful parent. Because even though our kids are really very good at being able to cut us down to size, by knowing just what to say to help us be aware of our weaknesses, just in case we hadn't noticed them, the fact is that they tend to have idealized pictures of us. And if we talk as though all we can tell them about is our accomplishments, we're not doing them any favors. And I said, we have a problem at this school, that there are some kids who come into 3rd and 4th grades with projects that have been done on make an Indian village that look like they have been done by professional architects, and they have. There are some kids in 11th grade who come in with essays that have been, look like they've been written by PhDs in English, and they have. You know, and when a parent takes over and is doing the work for the kid, the bad effect of that is that you're sort of saying what you can do isn't good enough. What's far more important is show some interest in what they're doing, help them out, but there's a critical threshold there between doing too much and too little. But the other thing that's important is tell them stories about what you messed up. Because in spite of their acting as though they think you're hopeless, you know, they're likely to be seeing you at the same time as somebody who has all of his or her act together. And when we do that to our kids, we make it seem as though they can't possibly be as good as they think we are, when in fact we are not that good. And it helps if the more successful the parent is, the more important it is for them to be able to tell stories about when they screwed up. Because it helps the kid to be able to realize that you made it, so maybe there's some hope for me. There was one situation I always ask about. I go on a fishing expedition when I'm doing initial interviews with patients. I'll ask about who's in the family and ask people to give me a few words about each person in the family. And then this, I remember this one kid who's listening to that, and I'll go through this list. Anybody who's had a lot of problems with focusing and learning. Anybody who was pretty smart, but they did better once they got out of school than when they were in school. And this one woman said, well, my brother's had a lot of trouble in school. In fact, he damn near flunked out of high school and was thinking he wouldn't even be able to finish it. And her son, who was about 13, looked to her and said, who are you talking about? And she says, Uncle Billy. And the kid looks, said, Uncle Billy? He owns a construction company. He's got 4 trucks. He's got a lot of people who work for him, and he lives in a really nice house. Uncle Billy almost flunked out of high school? Ma, listen. If he could do that, maybe there's some hope for me. It's important for kids to be able to get a sense of the problems that other people in the family have struggled with in order to be able to have a reasonable amount of hope for what they can do for themselves. And what I think is important, there's some parents who try so hard, some teachers who try so hard, say, you can do anything you want to. That's not true. You know? That's not realistic hope. You know, it's like somebody who's got a kid who's, you know, a fairly decent picture on his Little League team, but, you know, there's no way he's going to be a major leaguer. And, you know, if you build the fantasy that you can do something that you know is not within the range of what this person can do, you know, like, you know, the kid who's going to be, I had one not very long ago who was saying, I'm going to be a musician. I said, oh, what kind of music do you do? He said, well, I like to listen to music a lot. And I said, well, what instrument do you play? And he said, well, I got a guitar, and I began to learn. I said, acoustic or electric? He said, well, I've got one of those acoustic guitars, and then, you know, I'm practicing on it. And I really like doing it. I said, well, can you play anything that anybody would recognize? And he said, well, not yet, but I'm going to be able to do that. And he said, well, I just like to play rock. I want to maybe we'll form a band. This is a senior in high school. I said, do you have any clue what it takes for somebody to be able to be a professional musician? It's like you want to be a professional ball player and you've never played baseball. You know, and what are we doing when we feed that kind of fantasy? We're setting our kids up for failure. Now, on the other, you can fall off the other side of the pier and say, you can't do that. You know, and there's some things that they may very well surprise us with. Sometimes there's some transformations that happen as kids develop where they do amazing stuff that we never could have imagined. But it's a tricky balance trying to create realistic hopes, which are not setting the goals so high that they're going to be impossible for this kid to fulfill them, but at the same time are not shooting too low and not encouraging them to develop the strengths that they have. And that is a tricky balancing act for any of us to do.
We had a lot of questions about medication.
Okay.
So here's one. What alternatives or other supports do you recommend to use instead of medication?
Well, the first is education. Before medication, education, by which I mean teaching persons about the disorder. What is the nature of this disorder? What's the course of the disorder? What causes it? And so forth. Because that's the only chance you have to be able to make sense of your experience. And if you've got something which is so mysterious to everybody else and nobody understands why in the world it's this way, it's important for you to have that information. Then, I think it's important to offer the option of medication if it can be made available, but recognize it doesn't work for everybody. And even for those people for whom it does work, sometimes it's huge, sometimes substantial but not huge, sometimes a little but not that much, and 2 out of 10 it doesn't do a damn thing. So what else is there left? There's extra coaching. The 8 out of 10 that I use for talking about that is if you try both stimulants. We've got a couple of non-stimulants that sometimes work quite well for some people, but not for everybody. And there's some people who can't take it because it makes them too nervous or it has other adverse effects. Sometimes what needs to be done is you look at the diagnosis and see, is ADHD actually the primary diagnosis, or is there something else? Is there so much anxiety that this person is just immobilized by it? Or is there an underlying mood disorder where they're just riding a roller coaster of bipolar difficulties? It's important to be able to take a look at that as well. But it's also important to be able to provide some structure and support for the person to operate in the system that they've got and try and find what their strengths are. For example, I had a kid just a couple of weeks ago who was an amazing mechanic and was building stuff. And they showed me pictures of some of the stuff that he had built. He was building a motorbike and he's one of these kids who could take anything apart and put it back together so it actually worked. And he was being forced to go to a prep school where they had a general liberal arts curriculum. And he wanted to go to the trade school available to him because what he really wanted to do was to be a skilled woodworker or a mechanic. Those were the two he was interested in. And the parents kept telling him, you need to get a college degree and you're going to do much better if you go to this prep school rather than go to the trade school. And the fact is, this was a big mistake for this kid. He had a lot of difficulty with reading, and he'd gotten a lot of remedial help with the reading, but his reading was still very bad. He was bored out of his mind when he was doing traditional academic stuff, and he was amazing with the things he could do with his hands. And I don't know about you, but I can't fix my car. I need the mechanic next door to be able to fix it when anything goes wrong with the car that requires any more than just putting gas in it. And we need plumbers, we need electricians, we need people who can do carpentry, we need people who can program computers. There are a variety of ways in which people can get education, and sometimes I think we get too hung up on everybody's got to have a bachelor's degree. And we all know that there's some people where that's just not a good fit for what they're able to do or want to do. We've got just a couple more minutes.
Okay, I will do, there's one all-purpose question I'm going to save for the end. So here's the last.
Oh dear.
It's not that it's interesting. So here's the last meaty question. I'm deciding this one. What is your opinion about brain balancing programs such as CogMed?
That they're very good at teaching you how to do those little problems that they teach, but that they don't generalize and really make any difference. The scientific evidence for that is not impressive. Whether you're talking about CogMed or luminosity, the fact is that you can get better at doing those little computer exercises that they do. And if you ask parents who have spent a lot of money to get the program and to have their kid do it and have fought with the kid to get them to use it, the parents will tell you this is amazing. But if you ask for evaluation by teachers or other people who do not know who had the training and who didn't, the scientific evidence is seriously lame. You know, there's no shortcut to this. The brain is not a muscle, and the kind of cognitive difficulties that people face with ADHD are not likely to be helped by exercising it with that kind of thing. Same thing with neurofeedback.
Okay, I actually have two more really quick questions.
Okay.
This one I promised I would ask. I have two beagle puppies, just turned 7 months, who show signs of being ADHD. When and at what age can I expect these symptoms to disappear?
I don't have the foggiest.
Okay, and this is a question for everyone. We have a lost purse, black, small leather.
It's
Solved.
found? Okay, good.
All right. We have lost eyeglasses. At the front desk, there are eyeglasses if you've lost yours.
This reminds me of an ADHD convention I went to one day. The chair said, look, we're all at this hotel. There are 500 of us here. We have been here, most of us, for less than 2 hours, and they have already had reports from 15 people reporting they've lost their room keys. Be patient with the staff.
And along those lines, I just got another message. There is a UNC ID that evidently was lost, and it's on the book table over there.
Okay. Thanks very much for your attention.